What was concluded in Geneva last night is not a historic agreement. It's a historic mistake. This agreement has made the world a much more dangerous place. I know that many share the concern of Israel, especially in the region, and there's a reason for this. For years, the international community has demanded that Iran cease all uranium enrichment. Now, for the first time, the international community has formally consented that Iran continue its enrichment of uranium. And this is in direct contravention of UN Security Council resolutions.
All right, folks, there you have it. Benjamin Netanyahu speaking after the deal was signed on Saturday night. Joining us now to talk about that and much, much more is the author of his brand new one, Taking the Stand, My Life in the Law. Alan Dershowitz joins us. Hello, sir.
Hey, how are you?
I am fine. Good to talk to you again.
Likewise, thanks.
How's the book doing?
It's doing great. Writing an autobiography is hard. I have a long career, 50 years of law practice representing over 250 clients, 37 people charged with murder. I've represented presidents and prime ministers, and the stories are just fascinating.
They are. Listen, let's make a deal. After the holidays in January, you come up here when you're in the city, and we'll spend at least a half hour together, and we'll talk about it, okay?
I'm happy to do that. All
right. I'll talk to Chad as soon as I get off the air. We'll set that up with your office. Now, let's start with the deal. You gave an interview to Newsmax over the weekend once this deal was done, calling it a cataclysmic era of gigantic proportions. Couldn't you be any more definitive?
Well, I'm not all that definitive because there is a 10% chance that it could work. I mean, I do think that you have to give credit to those who made the deal for effort. They honestly believe that diplomacy will likely bring about an end to Iran's nuclear program. And there's a 10% possibility they're right. I think there's a 30 or 40% possibility that they're wrong. And I think the risk-benefit ratio strongly favored not accepting this deal, keeping the sanctions on, keeping the pressure on, and making the Iranians actually start dismantling their nuclear weapons program before we gave them any concessions. So I disagree with the deal, but I'm not prepared to say that it was motivated by anti-Israel feelings or anything of that kind.
Well, what's the other 50%? If you're saying 10% and 20 to 30 or 40%, where's the other 50% go?
Absolute uncertainty. Nobody knows. Nobody knows at this point whether or not this new guy, Rouhani, is actually more than a smiling face. I don't believe that. But it's possible that there are internal arguments going on within the Iranian government, and maybe they are moving in a different direction. We just don't know. The only thing that's certain is that we're uncertain. We're making this gamble in the face of considerable risks. And the real question is, do the risks, the positive outcome of the risks, outweigh the negatives? And I think for Israel, clearly the risks are too great. I think for the United States, they're too great. And by the way, this is not a dispute between Israel and the United States. Within the United States, as far as I can tell, the majority of experts did not favor this deal. The majority of nuclear experts, the majority of Iran experts, the majority of diplomatic experts are very, very skeptical. It seems to me like the majority of Democrats in Congress.
Right. I haven't heard one, Alan, come out and say it's a good deal.
No, because it's not a good deal. It's not a good deal when you are in a very strong negotiating position and you give up that negotiating position and you allow a victory for the weaker side. The Iranians are jumping up and down with joy. As far as they can see, they have won an unequivocal victory. Look what they've done. They've gotten a relief from the sanctions. They're going to now start getting business from China. They're going to be able to continue to develop triggers and other mechanisms that will be useful for any nuclear device. And what have they given up? They said, well, we're not going to do anything more at this point. We're going to stand still for 6 months. This sounds to me like the road to North Korea. And look what happened in North Korea. We claimed that we were giving diplomacy a chance, and what we gave was a chance for them to develop nuclear weapons. My favorite part of this, and my least favorite part actually, is that this administration seems to listen to Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, there's nobody in history that has a worse record when it comes to diplomacy. Everything he has ever advocated has turned out wrong. This guy is 100% wrong all the time. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. This guy was wrong on the Ayatollah Khomeini. This guy was wrong on the hostages. This guy has been wrong on the Israel-Palestine conflict. This guy was wrong on North Korea. This guy is wrong on Syria. He is wrong on everything. And yet people, because he has, an interesting background, seem to listen to him. He's an elder statesman who is always wrong about everything.
All right, Alan. Now, let me just play devil's advocate here, and at the same time, it's what I actually believe. I mean, I don't see the 10% because here you have a regime that that is holding 3 Americans. Did they make a goodwill effort? Did they make a goodwill gesture and release even one of them along with this?
Did they say?
The State Department claims it was brought up, but I'm just saying. And again, you're right. Put the onus on us. Yes, but they're also at the same time killing our soldiers in Afghanistan as we talk. They're the leading sponsor of worldwide terror, Hezbollah, etc. I mean, so it's not just that it's a nuclear issue. I'm devastated that they're talking to these people, not in a broad context, but just about this, when they're still allowed unfettered to do everything else I just mentioned. I don't see how you could trust them at all.
I agree with that. I think we're probably speaking to them on broader issues, but we're not ready to say that they're prepared to give up their support for Hezbollah, which is a murderous terrorist organization. Remember, the Iranians killed 240-something American Marines.
Yep.
They blew up a Jewish community center in Argentina. They killed diplomats. This is the greatest state sponsor of terrorism in the history of the world.
And it's the hand Obama couldn't wait to shake.
Right, and we didn't, as far as I can tell, at least in public, didn't ask them to have a moratorium on terrorism. It'd be interesting to hear whether they say maybe there was an implicit agreement. Let's see if Hezbollah stops engaging in terrorism. I doubt that will happen. Look, the reason I say 10% is if we could stop them from developing a nuclear bomb, turn them away from terrorism, the way we did Libya, the way the Ukraine on its own did and South Africa on its own did, how much better would that be than a military attack or even continuation of sanctions? Diplomacy is better. As Churchill said, jaw is better than war. So I'm willing to give them 10%. I'm willing to give them a B in effort, but I have to give them a B- to a C-, depending on grade inflation, in negotiating skills. I don't think this is bad intentioned. I just think this is dumb.
All right, we're talking to Alan Dershowitz, author, of course, of his latest Taking the Stand, My Life in the Law. Of course, I don't have to tell you about the rest of his credentials. His name says it all. But now I want to ask you about the Supreme Court today announcing they will take up Obamacare versus freedom of religion in a couple of cases, one of them the Hobby Lobby case. Right. And basically it boils down to do private employers have to provide religious contraception, provide contraception even if it's against their religious beliefs. Hobby Lobby's basically saying, we'll go out of business first and we're getting fined to death. And Supreme Court says, well, listen, what does this mean?
Well, there is the Religious Restoration Act that was passed after the Supreme Court rendered a terrible decision forbidding a Jewish chaplain from wearing a kippah, yarmulke, when he was testifying in a case. Really, really a stupid Rehnquist decision, and Congress virtually unanimously overruled that in a broad statute that is at issue in these cases. I suspect that the Supreme Court will split the difference in some way. They will respect the religious rights of corporations, even if they're corporations. Corporations, after all, are people for purposes of contributing money. They're certainly people for purposes of having freedom of religion, particularly if they're a closed corporation and a corporation that has an ideology. But there are ways around this. For example, the way in which somebody has to avoid military service if they're a conscientious objector, they may have to do the equivalent of service that doesn't violate their religious beliefs. So it may be possible to split the difference here and say that corporations have to contribute somehow to Medicaid funding, but they don't have to contribute in a way that can help support principles that are in violation of their religious practices. So they don't have to give money to promote birth control or abortion, but they have to give additional money to prevent cancer. Now, no religion is against preventing cancer. So if it's not about money, if it's really about ideology, there are ways around it. There are some people who suspect, of course, that some of the people who are objecting to this really are the Obama health care, and are just using this as an excuse. So figuring out a way of making them pay their fair share without requiring them to violate their religious principles may be striking the appropriate balance.
All right. Well, that seems pretty easy. I mean, I don't know how much of the healthcare contribution that they're required to make for contraception. I don't think that could cost that much. But let me move on. We got 3 minutes. I want to ask you. I had the honor of sitting down with a former student of yours, Ted Cruz, at Restoration Weekend down in Florida a couple of weekends ago, and we were talking about, and he brought up how Barack Obama is in violation of the Constitution. Selectively enforcing laws when it comes to Obamacare, changing the law, delaying the law. He's done it with other laws, and said that this is, just illegal, unconstitutional. I asked him if it was impeachable. He said he would urge the House to do what it feels is best. But have you ever seen a president with a record like this?
Well, I challenged Ted Cruz to debate that issue with me and to debate the issue of whether closing down the government is in violation of the spirit of the Constitution. I don't think impeachment should be used except in cases of extreme criminality. It shouldn't be used for political differences. Political differences should be resolved at the polls. Let Ted Cruz run against.
But is this against the law in your view? Is it unconstitutional what he's doing?
It's so hard to say that. First of all, there are two things. One, is it against the spirit of the law? The second, is it something that's enforceable? Can you go into court and enforce it? Probably not. It's probably a political question that the courts would want to stay away from. So I think it's better for Ted Cruz, who's a very bright guy and a very principled guy, to be making his arguments in the political context rather than in the legal context.
All right, so I'll just try one more time. But what the president's doing, can a president take a law, and the argument against the shutdown was this is settled law. Can a president make exemptions, exceptions, delays to settled law, tell ICE not to deport people, tell them not to defend DOMA, relax the work provision in the welfare reform of a law that's 20 years old? Can a president do that?
Well, nobody knows the answer to that. The executive power the president has so expanded since the time that the framers wrote the Constitution. At the time of the Constitution, most of the power was in the hands of the legislature. In fact, the heads of Congress were more famous around the world in some ways than presidents because they had more power. But we have evolved into a much more executive-centric system, and we're still evolving. The law is changing and the practices are changing. So this is not the right time to freeze it. And the Supreme Court is a coordinate branch of government. They're not going to decide, essentially, that the president has exercised too much power or Congress too little power. I think this is going to play itself out in the political process, not in the legal arena.
All right. Listen, Alan, happy Thanksgiving, happy Hanukkah, happy New Year, and we will speak in January. You will be up here sitting in studio with me, and I look forward to it.
That would be great. I'd look forward to it.
Thank you. Take care. Happy That's Alan Dershowitz. Taking the Stand, My Life in the Law, here on the Steve Malzberg Show. When we come back, Time Magazine photographer Robert Nicholsberg has a great new book, Afghanistan, A Distant War. Great pictures. Steve Malzberg Show coming up, Newsmax TV